Hello, this is the last in our 3-week mini-series on Matthew chapter 10. And what we've been looking at is Jesus' final teaching before sending out his disciples. It is full of wisdom. It reads kind of like a preach, but knowing how Jesus operated, I wonder if this was actually more of a conversation, maybe over dinner, maybe spread over several hours. I imagine the disciples asking questions and Jesus sharing wisdom, reminding them of what they've already learned, what they've witnessed, what they've experienced. But as a scribe, Matthew can't record the whole evening conversation, every joke that might have been shared, every silent moment as they literally digested food and metaphorically digested what he was saying, every bit of banter. So obviously he just recorded the absolute gold, the wisdom, the things that Jesus said that would still be true in years to come, the metaphors that made them all think. And so we end up with chapter 10, a powerful message of the preparation for disciples. So why don't we pause now and read this in our groups? We are looking at Matthew 10 from 26 through to 42. Over to you. This is some heavy teaching. I don't know about you, but for me, this is one of those passages that I have to read quite a few times before it begins to sink in, or before I can make sense of what Jesus is saying and what it means and what's going on. And this is only like a third of the whole of chapter 10. So we're going to break it up into chunks and kind of look at sections and understand the different sections together, and then pause for discussion after each one. So we'll start with just looking at verses 26 through to 31. Now here we see Jesus says, "Do not be afraid," 3 times. And he gives 3 different reasons to not be afraid. So the first one comes, "Don't be afraid, because there is nothing hidden that will not be made known." This is about darkness. This is essentially about evil. Don't be afraid of evil, of what Satan is doing, because it will all come out in the light. This is what Jesus is saying to us. Instead of being afraid, instead of tiptoeing around, instead, Jesus says to proclaim from the rooftops, declare the truth in public, in light, and don't be afraid of what is going on in the darkness. Secondly, he says, "Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul." Jesus here is talking about death. Don't be afraid of physical death, because even when we die, and everyone does die, that isn't the end. Our soul continues. And so as long as our soul isn't destroyed, as long as our soul isn't turned evil, then we don't need to fear. Now, obviously, we don't take this lightly. I'm not saying this lightly at all. That is not a small thing to say, to not fear death. We could probably do a whole small group session just on this one thing. But this is what we are signing up for, and we often forget that. It's so easy to think that Christianity is about being nice or being a lifestyle choice even, but it isn't. And Jesus says to be ready for persecution, or even ready for death itself, and not fear it. I'm going to talk a bit more about that later on. But Jesus says instead we should fear the judgment of God, because that is way worse than death itself. We don't spend very long thinking about that. We often talk about God as our loving Father who is gracious and compassionate, forgiving and loving and protective, and all of that is true. But he is also the ultimate judge, and it is God only who decides our fate after death. And so if we're going to be fearful, then let's be fearful about the judgment of God rather than being fearful about death. I'm very sorry that my laptop just beeped. And the third thing that Jesus says is don't be afraid, because you are worth so much more to God. More than many sparrows, in fact, is what Jesus says here. I actually find this a really funny metaphor for worth, for what we're worth. So it might say in our Bibles that sparrows are sold 2 for a penny, which implies that sparrows are pretty much worthless. Like you can buy 2 of them for a penny. They're not going to be worth much, are they? But the Greek word that was used here is the word asariu, which at the time, that was a copper coin that was worth 1/16 of a day's wages for a labourer. Okay, just try and track with me here. So I'll just say that again. The Greek word that was the word asario, and this was the word for a copper coin. So we say penny, but it was an asario, and that would be worth roughly 1/16 of a day's wages for your average labourer. Okay, so it's not worth nothing. It's not a penny. It's worth more than that. Now, if we want to turn that into today's value, so 1/16 of a day's wage, well, obviously it depends what your wages are. But let's just say that you're on 30k a year, just for example. So that would mean a day's wage for you would be £120, and 1/16 of that is £7.50. So so instead of a penny, it's £7.50. So two sparrows are worth £7.50. Right, I know that I've lost half of you already. I know that all the people that don't love maths have now entirely switched off, so I'm really sorry. But I know also that some of you are really tracking with this and maybe even enjoying it. So I'm going to keep going. And now, if your salary is £100,000 per year, then I'm not going to go through all the maths again, but essentially an asario would work out at £25. And so 2 sparrows for you would be the same as £25. So depending on your salary, Jesus is saying you are worth more than, I don't know, a couple of coffees for £7.50 or a takeaway for £25. So that is your worth, which is quite a strange comparison to how much we're worth. But there's also the caveat that every single hair on your head is numbered, which shows just how precious you are to God. And so we go as disciples with his protection as well. We go with both the protection of he knows every single hair on our head, but as well, we go into discipleship, into the mission field, knowing that death is part of what is ahead of us. So let's pause for discussion now. I would like you to imagine that you are one of the disciples back in the day, in the room with Jesus. Maybe you're John or Peter, or maybe you're Matthew himself that's writing all this down, and you're sitting there with Jesus. Just try and picture that now. Picture the room you're in. Maybe you're sat around a table, or you might just picture it in modern day times and you're sitting on sofas. Whatever works for you. Just picture you're there in the room, and what you've just heard him say is, do not fear, 3 times. He said it 3 times, do not fear. And the first time he said it, maybe your internal response was, yeah, I'm not afraid, I'm fine. Like, yeah, I know. And maybe the second time he said it, you wondered why he'd said it again. You're like, yeah, you've already said that. But the third time he said it, it really made you think. And the question that you asked yourself is, what am I afraid of? What am I afraid of? What would you be most afraid of? And think about that now. What scares you most about being Jesus's hands and feet right now, where you are in your life, whatever you're doing? The invitation to pray for people, to cast out demons, sharing your faith. What are you most afraid of? And I'd love you, if you feel you can, to share that in your groups now. Okay, we're going to move on to the next section now. We're going to be looking at verses 32 through to verses 32 to verses 37 now. So Jesus talks here about his place in the lives of his followers. If we put Jesus before everyone else, we are putting God above everything else. If we put Jesus before everyone else, then we are putting God above everything else. If we choose other people before Jesus, then we are not choosing God first. And verses 34, 35 and 36 really stand out to me here. Jesus tells his disciples not to assume he has come to bring peace, but he has come to bring a sword, which means truth. He says, "For I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against his mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." Obviously, Jesus hasn't come specifically to do those things. That isn't what he's saying. He's not saying, I've come so that families can turn against each other. I've come to bring conflict in households. But what he's saying here is that the truth is way more important than peace. And so if following Jesus means disagreements within families, if our own family doesn't agree with the decision we make to follow Jesus, then the question is, are we willing to walk away from them in order to follow him? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean cutting all ties from our family and never speaking to them again, although certainly in some cases that is true and that is what happens. But the question is, are we willing to put Jesus above our own parents, above our own siblings, above our own households? Are we willing to follow him regardless of what they say or think? And do you know what? This might not even be that for you that you're a Christian, your family isn't a Christian, and it's that level of disagreement. It might be that you've grown up in a Christian household, but the way you're following Jesus is different to the way they're following Jesus, or perhaps they're not, and you really want to press into what it looks like to follow Jesus, and you're having to shake off some of those things that you've been brought up with and separate your parents' faith from your own. I don't know. In Exodus 20, verse 12, one of the commandments tells us to honour our father and mother. And so Jesus, as always, is fulfilling the law by addressing this. He does not advocate disloyalty to family, but instead he calls us to place loyalty to God even above loyalty to our family. Now, this is only a short section, but I'd really like to pause it now and give you an opportunity to talk about your relationship with your family. Now, it might be that this doesn't connect and you have a great relationship with your family and it's not a problem, in which case that's okay to share that and to celebrate that. But there will also be people where there are disagreements, or family members don't support it, or you can't talk about it, or what that, and that is the case for me, that none of my family are Christians, and we don't really get to talk about it very much. They don't really want to know about it, and although they don't not support me, they also don't actively support the way I choose to live, and that's difficult at times. And so I don't want to just skip over this section without giving space for just people to be real with each other about what your family life looks like, and maybe even pray for each other if that's appropriate. Okay, over to you. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. Anyone who welcomes you welcomes me, and anyone who welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet as a prophet will receive a prophet's reward, and whoever welcomes a righteous person as a righteous person will receive a righteous person's reward. And if anyone gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones who is my disciple, truly I tell you, that person will certainly not lose their reward. And so the final words of Jesus to his disciples before he sends them out to be his hands and feet are about sacrifice and reward. We now know that Jesus carried his own cross up a big hill and to his own death. He walked into death carrying the very thing that he would die on. And we too are called to take up our cross and follow him. Be willing to give up everything. Be willing to walk into death, walk into hardship, walk into tough times, just like Jesus did, and hold the weight of our cross. And there is a reward, but the reward isn't protection from those things. The reward isn't an easy, happy life where nothing bad ever happens. The reward isn't a nice house and a good job and 2 holidays a year. This isn't Ant and Dec's Saturday night takeaway where you could win a place on the plane. When we lose our lives, we give up everything, and then we find real life with Jesus. I met up for coffee recently with a friend, and she was telling me about her sister who is really struggling to know if she believes in Jesus. And the sister had said to my friend, she said, I get why people go to church and I get how it works for them, but I just don't know if it works for me. And the thing is, none of us should be following Jesus because it works for us. And if we're thinking, well, this works for me, then I honestly think we've missed it. I think we've missed the entire gospel. Because that way of thinking suggests a belief that day-to-day life is better with God, that following Jesus will just make everything easier or everything better. And I know we talk about this kind of belief and how it's not true, but I wonder how many of us deep down actually do have this misconception, even if it's just a little bit. How many of us think that bad things won't happen if we follow Jesus? If we make sacrifices to follow him and put him first, then surely he won't let anything bad happen to us. And then, unfortunately, we are deeply disappointed when crap goes down, when someone we know dies or gets ill, or we get ill, or we lose our job, or a pandemic hits and everything changes. When people in our lives let us down, and honestly, they will. Or when church lets us down, and honestly, it will. Or when things don't go as expected, as we wanted them to, as we hoped they will. Then this way of thinking means that we throw our hands up in the air and we ask God, where are you? How could you have let this happen to me? And you know what? This is where we hold the truth of the Bible in both hands, and we have to know both things at the same time, because we are worth so much to God. As Jesus has just said, every hair on our head is numbered. He knows us intimately. He loves us deeply. And Jesus says that he doesn't let bad things happen to the sparrows. So surely we can expect the same. But in the same breath, he says we are asked to take up our cross when we follow him. We can expect all the same things that life throws at everyone. We can expect hardship and pain and death. But if we keep our eyes on Jesus, if we continue to be his hands and his feet, then the reward is not in day-to-day comfort and ease. The reward is in what we find in our relationship with God. I'd like to tell you about my friends Rich and Ness. I know that some of you know them. Rich is the leader of the Fusion movement, and Ness leads a church called Open Heaven in Loughborough. 15 years ago, they had a little boy. It was their second child. They already had a daughter. And the little boy was born very, very ill. He only lived for a day or two, and then he died in their arms. 2 years later, they went on to have a little girl called Lauren. And just 18 months after she was born, when she was still a toddler, they found a lump on Lauren's leg, and it was cancer. They then underwent 18 months of hell, of treatment, of chemo, of hair loss, a lot of sickness, weekly, if not more, hospital visits. All of that trying to look after Lauren while also giving their other daughter the care and attention that a 6-year-old needs. They faced losing Lauren, but amazingly, she survived. And she grew up. And 2 years ago, Rich's brother James was diagnosed with cancer. The prognosis wasn't good, and despite treatment, he deteriorated quickly. Last year, Lauren, just weeks before her 13th birthday, was taken to hospital with severe headaches. And it was so bad that she was being sick. And a scan showed a brain tumour. A new kind of cancer, totally different to the one she had before. They operated, but they couldn't remove it, and so they couldn't remove all of it. They removed some of it, but they had to start treatment. Rich's brother James died last year. James was a father to 2 girls. In December, Lauren was moved to a hospice where she lost the use of her legs, her arms, her sight, and then unfortunately she died. There has been so much pain and suffering for Rich and Ness, with no promise that that's the end of it. No promise that they've had their fill and from now on it'll all be fine. And Ness and Rich have given their whole lives to sharing the gospel, to making Jesus known, discipling young people, following Jesus. They've given their whole lives. They're incredible followers of Jesus. Their reward is not protection from bad things happening. Our reward is not the protection from bad things happening in our lives. But do you know what? They refuse to let this change their image of God. They refuse to see themselves as victims, or as the couple that lost the baby, or the lady whose daughter died, or the guy who lost his brother. They refuse for this to change their identity, because their identity is in Jesus alone. And that's what Jesus means here. Whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. When we are willing to give up everything, absolutely everything, including our identity, when we are willing to realize that we are not in control of this life, and stuff will happen, and it will be hard, and we will work through some really, really tough times. When we know that, yes, God is in control, but that does not mean that we get to live an easy life, then we find who we are in Jesus, and that changes everything. And so this is a tough place to go from. I get that. This doesn't lend itself to a nice discussion now in our groups. But what I would suggest that you do now is just spend a few minutes praying about it. Maybe before you start talking, you have a moment with God now. There's a song called For the Sake of the World. And I'd suggest that you put that on if you've got a facility to do that, and just listen to it and use it to pray or worship or connect or think. And then I'd recommend you get into twos and pray for each other for whatever has come up in this area. But really, I'd pray that your identity, our identities are rooted more in Jesus than ever before. I finished writing this talk last week. I finished it on Thursday afternoon, and then I came downstairs and I put the lead on my dog, my puppy, who's only 10 months old. He desperately needed a walk. It was 3:00 in the afternoon. We went out for a walk, and 5 minutes into the walk, he got run over, and I watched him die immediately. And the last few days have been absolutely awful, as we as a family have journeyed through death and pain and grief, and you know, it really, really hurts. Not just that we've lost our dog, who, if you're a dog person, you'll know they become totally part of your family, but the trauma of seeing him hit by a van and dying. But I don't know, it wasn't lost on me that I had just finished really journeying this with God and then going out and experiencing real pain. I am not in any way saying that God made that happen, but it's in those moments that we have to stand on the truth that is in the Bible, that God has not forsaken us or abandoned us, but he is with us in everything that we do, and he loves us deeply. And so I pray that you know Jesus more today than yesterday, and that your identity is rooted in him. That song is called For the Sake of the World.